brief introduction for myself, since I'd like to think that folks are much more interested in bees and pollinator conservation than they are me. With regards to bee lawns, this was actually my graduate student project when I was a student at the University of Minnesota. Very passionate about it. I think it's a wonderful tool for folks, and I'm excited to share with you. I think it's good to note that this is a collaboration between, this research was a collaboration between the university's turfgrass science lab and the pollinator conservation lab. So we're going to be touching conservation from a few different angles, both the conservation of natural resources and the conservation of pollinators, where of course the overall goal of this planting type and the overall goal of lawns to legumes is to conserve pollinators. But as many of you have likely become aware, there's so much conservation we could do at the same time while we're trying to conserve pollinators. So we'll talk about using less fertilizer, mowing less frequently to conserve natural resources, and really just the idea of conservation across the board as it applies to flowering bee lawns. So I like to break this presentation up into three basic sections. First, the cultural and ecological functions of the lawn. This will kind of be a little bit of a background portion to get everyone on the same page as to why do we even have lawns, what is the goal of a bee lawn, and then kind of, the overall goals of this planting. Then we'll move on to what actually is a bee lawn, the elements of a bee lawn, or the actual building blocks and components that go into creating a bee lawn. And then finally, this all is for naught if you don't know how to install these, and we'll talk about how to get our virtual hands dirty and install a bee lawn. So we'll start off with that cultural and ecological functions of the lawn. So many folks are surprised to find that me, a degree-earning ecologist, talks a whole lot about turfgrass, where when you think about ecology and the conservation of natural resources and pollinators, I doubt that the vision that you have in your mind is the turfgrass lawn. And one of the very first questions I often get is, why do we even have turfgrass lawns in the first place? And what I tell folks is the key to ecology, especially urban ecology, is it's all about finding the right planting type for the right place. If someone were to ask me, James, what is the most ecologically sound thing I could plant in my yard? I absolutely would not say a turfgrass lawn or a bee lawn for that matter. But the fact of the matter is that the turfgrass lawn is what's best suited for recreation, gathering, play, things that folks love to do in their yard, things that truthfully help to connect folks to nature. And as much as I love the beautiful pocket plantings that they promote in lawns to legumes, you can't really play fetch with your dog in a 4-foot native prairie. You can't, sit around and have a picnic in that 4-foot native prairie. So it's all about finding the right planting for the right place. The turfgrass lawn has its place. It's for where we want play and recreation. And I want us to think of a bee lawn as just a step up from that traditional turfgrass lawn, where we're both conserving more resources and we're putting in some low-growing flowers that can support our pollinators. I think it's important to think about the overall impact that this can have, improving our turfgrass lawns. There is a whole lot of turfgrass in the United States, especially in our urban and suburban areas. If we take a look at this map, those areas with those green blotches indicate areas of high turfgrass prevalence. If we look around where I grew up, the New York City area, you see a big old patch of green, and that's true for a lot of the Northeast United States. If we look into Southern California in that LA area, you see another big old patch of green showing lots of turfgrass. But truth be told, even if we look throughout the state of Minnesota, especially at the Twin Cities, you see another big patch of green, meaning there is a ton of turfgrass here in the Twin Cities and throughout the state of Minnesota. And when I think of this, when I think of how much turfgrass that we have, I look at turfgrass as the low-hanging fruit. It's so accessible. Many folks interact with turfgrass every day of their lives, walking through their yard, playing in their lawns with their dogs. And if we could just take some small incremental steps to improve the ecological footprint of this planting type that's so ubiquitous throughout our communities, we can make a ton of difference. So the basics of this idea is quite simple. We want to transform the turfgrass lawn, which is planted almost as a green swath of carpet. We want to integrate some low-growing flowers, so we're not fully removing the turfgrass. We're kind of creating this nice medley of turfgrass and flowers working together to create what we call a flowering lawn, this beautiful combination of turfgrass and wildflowers that can both allow for that recreation and those traditional functions of turfgrass that we've all grown accustomed to, while also putting in some forage for our at-risk pollinators. And all at the same time, these flowers and these grasses that we're using, they're also what we call low input, meaning that they don't need as much water, they don't need as much fertilizer, they don't need as frequent mowing. We'll talk more about that later. So the goals of a bee lawn, and I'll go over these quickly before diving deeper into them. We want them to be low maintenance. We, of course, want to protect our pollinators, and we even want to try and improve local water quality. So first, low maintenance characteristics. It's important to note that I'll be using this term interchangeably with the term low input. Low input is kind of the turfgrass science jargon for a low maintenance characteristic. So we want the vegetation that we use to be drought tolerant. I used to have to explain this in a whole lot of depth. Then in 2021, 2022, and 2023, we had severe drought throughout almost all of Minnesota. Everyone was looking for drought tolerant vegetation. But the basic point here is that drought tolerant vegetation does not need to be watered as frequently. The more water we can save, the better. We want to use vegetation with a slow vertical growth rate. I know for myself, my least favorite thing to do during the growing season, during the spring, summer, and fall, is to go out with my mower and waste a beautiful day chopping off some turf grass. The slower our vegetation grows, the less frequently we have to mow it, and also low fertility needs. I know that this is Minnesota, it's the land of 10,000 lakes. When I moved to Minnesota, what I didn't know is that more than 50% of the lakes in Minnesota are considered to be contaminated. And it's important to note that one of the leading causes to that contamination is the use of fertilizer. When we use fertilizer, especially if we apply it in too great of quantities and concentrations, a lot of those nutrients can leach off of our lawns and run off into our nearby watersheds, bringing nitrogen, phosphorus, and all sorts of other nutrients and chemicals into our nearby bodies of water. If any of you have seen a lake or a body of water nearby that's suffering from eutrophication or algal blooms, in many cases, that's due to that runoff of those excess nutrients in fertilizers. So the less frequently we can fertilize our lawns, the better. Pollinator protection. I would hope that this is a rather obvious goal of a bee lawn, but we'll dive into it a little bit now anyway. Every flower that's selected for a bee lawn is chosen specifically for its pollinator value. The three that we're seeing here, Dutch white clover, creeping thyme, and self-heal, were three flowers that I studied myself at the University of Minnesota, and we saw some really exciting results. We'll dive into those more later. But the basics that you should know is we're not just putting in any old flower that happens to be able to grow into a lawn. These flowers are backed by research. We know that they provide value to pollinators, both in terms of the fact that they'll visit them and the fact that the forage they're providing is high quality. The nectar and pollen that we're providing for these pollinators are high quality. So bee lawns and stormwater conservation. When we can, we want to keep stormwater from entering our watershed and instead allow it to infiltrate within the managed landscapes that we are in control of. And I'd hope that when some of you looked at this picture, a light bulb went off saying, boy, that is not what I expected a bee lawn or a pollinator lawn to look like. And you would be absolutely right. Where when I'm talking with a resident and they want to reduce stormwater runoff within a landscaped area that they manage, without fail, what I tell them to plant is something like this, a beautiful rain garden. This is actually one that the good folks at Metro Blooms installed themselves. And this is a plan for a rain garden that Metro Blooms installed. So when that idea is, how can we reduce stormwater runoff without fail? The first thing I do is say, let's get a rain garden in here. That is going to capture hundreds of thousands of gallons of stormwater runoff per year. What folks sometimes fail to think about is a rain garden, even a big one, is only going to cover a few hundred square feet. Generally, your typical green space in an urban or suburban dwelling is going to be a few thousand square feet. So where I like to tell folks that a bee lawn can come into play here is this is just a complementary tool throughout your landscape. Native plantings, absolutely superior to a bee lawn. Rain garden, superior to a bee lawn. However, with all of those turfgrass areas that you can't afford to turn into a rain garden or a native landscape, these are great opportunities to put in a bee lawn, because when we compare a bee lawn to that traditional turf grass, we're dealing with much more comprehensive, deeper root systems that will allow for superior infiltration. And if we're reducing stormwater runoff even a little bit, it's going to pay dividends within our community. So that is the basic context, the basic background for what we're looking to do today, understanding where we're currently at with lawns and what we hope to accomplish with a bee lawn. So now we can talk about the elements or the building blocks of a bee lawn. So this is also going to be broke up into three sections. First, it might not be the most exciting part, but boy, is it important, talking about what turfgrass species are best suited for a bee lawn. Then we're going to talk about the floral species that work best for a bee lawn. And finally, the part that I think is most fun, granted I'm an entomologist, so I am very biased, what pollinators do we actually see visiting a bee lawn? So, which turfgrass species is going to work best? So, first off, and this is something that the university's turfgrass science program, the University of Minnesota's turfgrass science program, that is, has been studying for years, probably decades. We want to use low maintenance turfgrass species, meaning those turfgrass species that don't require as much water, not as much irrigation, that don't require as frequent mowing, reducing our carbon footprint, and less frequent applications of fertilizers. This is something that we've been doing for years. What we also want to think about is the competitive biological nature of a plant, where typically with lawns, we want them to exclude flowering species. Most people will look at a flower in a lawn and say, ew, get that weed out of there. Not us. Today, we're looking at grasses and flowers and saying, kumbaya, let's all work together. So, how this works from a biological standpoint, we've got grasses and flowers coming in together. If we were working with grasses that were highly competitive, what we would expect is a competitive exclusion of a lot of those flowers. So if we're using highly aggressive and competitive grasses, we would see low forb establishment. Then if we were to try and do this very same deal with some grasses that are a little bit less competitive, so grasses that grow a little bit slower, don't require as many nutrients, you would expect lots of flowers to be able to establish. And this is something that we actually tested at the university. We tested highly competitive grasses and grasses that weren't quite as aggressive, and asked the question, how will flowers establish alongside these different types of grasses? So in that bottom right corner, you can see a species of clover. This is actually Cura clover. And we grew this species of flower alongside the four most common cool season turf grasses: Kentucky bluegrass, hard fescue, which is a type of fine fescue, tall fescue, and perennial ryegrass. And if you look at that little graphic I have towards the top, you can see we've got two leaf blades that are thinner with slower rates of growth, and two leaf blades that are thicker with faster rates of growth. Where the thought is that the thinner leaf blades with slower rates of growth aren't quite as competitive, and the grass species with wider leaf blades and faster rates of growth are going to be more competitive. And what we found was that grass type had a tremendous impact on how flowers are able to co-establish. With those less competitive grass species, the fine fescues and the Kentucky bluegrasses, we saw lots of floral vegetation and lots of floral blooms. With the perennial ryegrasses and tall fescues, we saw very few blooms and very little floral vegetation. So ultimately, we had two floral species that were at least adequate performers. But when we try to decide which grass species is going to be the absolute best fit for establishing a bee lawn, for co-establishing along flowers, we go with the fine fescues. And that's because the Kentucky bluegrass is too high input. It takes too much management in order to perform well. And what I mean by that is fine fescues do three things exceptionally well that Kentucky bluegrass struggles with in the terms of inputs or management. One, fine fescues have very low fertility needs, whereas Kentucky bluegrass has very high fertility needs. The standard for Kentucky bluegrass is to apply 3 pounds of nitrogen-based fertilizer throughout the year. With fine fescue, the recommendation is to supply 1/2 of a pound of nitrogen per year with a fertilizer. But what's great about fine fescues is you can also bring nitrogen into your lawn area simply by leaving your clippings. And if you leave your clippings with a fine fescue lawn, you will never have to apply any sort of nitrogen-based fertilizer. Another great benefit of the fine fescues is they exhibit exceptional drought tolerance. The norm for a Kentucky bluegrass lawn, in the heat of summer at least, is to water 2 to 4 times per week. This will vary a little bit based on just how hot it is here in Minnesota. All Minnesotans know that a summer's day can be a high of 65. It can also be a high of 95. You truly never know how the weather's going to hit here. But with the fine fescues, the norm is to water once every 2 to 3 weeks. So we're going from watering multiple times a week to maybe a few times a month. If you want to be real aggressive with your watering of fine fescue, I'd say you go nuts and you water once a week. Still a far cry from what you'd see in the Kentucky bluegrasses. And the third aspect of fine fescues that I like to touch base on is the one that I am most excited about and the one that I think has the strongest ecological impact. That is the slow-growing nature of the fine fescues. Kentucky bluegrasses are typically mowed once every 7 to 10 days. Fine fescues are mowed about 2 to 6 times per year, depending on personal preference. This means that if you mow your fine fescues once per month throughout the growing season, you will be just fine for the year. So, a tremendous difference from what folks are used to with their Kentucky bluegrass lawns. The main drawback that I'll see with fine fescues with regards to how they can be a fit for a family lawn is they don't have as strong of traffic tolerance as Kentucky bluegrasses or other common species. So general walking through your yard, light recreation is totally fine. But if you've got big dogs or kids that really like to play sports in your yard, heavy activity, then you might want to consider mixing in a little bit of Kentucky bluegrass alongside the fine fescue. So you still have something that's a little bit more low input, a little bit more eco-friendly, and is going to allow space for those flowers to co-establish. So now that we understand which turfgrass species are a good fit for our pollinator lawns, we can start thinking about something a little bit more fun, a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. What flowers are going to work well within a flowering bee lawn? So, preferred floral species. When we were trying to think about what flowers can work well within a bee lawn, we had a few boxes that we wanted to check, so to say. So first, we wanted to use flowers that can tolerate lawn management practices. This is all just a fancy way of saying we need to be able to mow you and you bounce back. Where even through no mow May and other similar measures where folks try to reduce mowing, you can't go all the way to never mowing. We want something where when you run that mower through your yard periodically, the flowers aren't going to just die off, they'll bounce back and continue to bloom. We also wanted flowers that can provide high quality forage for our bees. Something that not everyone realizes is the floral value, the nutritional value of a flower varies from species to species, where just because you see a bee on a flower doesn't mean it's providing high quality forage for a flower. You could think of bees as being not too far of a difference from trying to feed little children. Bees will go just about anywhere for their nectar, but they are way more picky when it comes to where am I going to get my pollen, where am I going to get my protein. Where anyone who's tried to feed a child before knows they'll go crazy for McDonald's, they'll go crazy for those chicken nuggets, but that doesn't mean it's healthy for them. We don't want to just put flowers out there that are attracting them and then providing low quality provisions. We want to provide flowers that are rich in nectar quality, meaning lots of sugar present in the nectar, and providing pollen that's very high in protein content as well. So it's not just a matter of will you visit, it's a matter of what is the nutritional value of those flowers. And finally, as best as we can, we want to try to incorporate native flowers. Native flowers co-evolve alongside our pollinators for thousands, actually millions of years. Bees have been around for tens of millions, I believe even hundreds of millions of years. And they have this co-evolutionary history of bees and flowers. They've learned how to gather resources from native flowers for a very long time. There's some research that shows that pollinators spend less time foraging on a flower when it's native because they understand how to get the resources from them quicker. And there's just these general rules that native plants tend to be more accustomed to our native landscapes. They're less likely to get beaten out by a tough Minnesota winter or a dry Minnesota summer because they've been adapting to this climate for so long. So as best we can, we try to incorporate native flowers. That's not to say that all non-native flowers are inherently bad. You can have beneficial non-native flowers, and we'll talk about some of those. But as best you can, incorporating native flowers is a nice, safe bet. So the first flower that I'll highlight is self-heal. That is Prunella vulgaris, and the specific subspecies lanceolata, that's the subspecies that's native to the entirety of the United States. And from a bee's perspective, it's got these medium to large size whorled blooms. A whorled bloom is when the flower is kind of a little bit closed off, where if you look at how those petals circle around the neck of the flower, the corolla, you can kind of see that there's a little bit of a tubular nature to it, meaning that a bee with a long tongue is going to have an easy time getting the nectar and the resources out of this flower, whereas a bee with a shorter tongue might struggle a little bit more. Research history suggested that this flower was primarily a nectar source, and this is a flower that is rather diverse in terms of the settings that it can survive in. It does well in full sun, through part sun, and it can survive in both rich to moist soils. Creeping thyme in many aspects is very, very different from the self-heal. Here we've got these teeny tiny wide open blooms that lends itself really nicely to smaller pollinators with those shorter bee tongues. Something that's great about creeping thyme is it has exceptional drought tolerance and winter hardiness, and it can even serve as a natural deer deterrent. Deer do not like the scent and the taste associated with the thyme vegetation. So a note about creeping thyme, it does exceptionally well in sandy soils. It only does so in, more of a clay soil or even like a typical black dirt kind of soil. It'll do okay in a black dirt. It's really more so clay soils or soils that tend to stay very, very moist that I'd be more concerned with. Creeping thyme, you'll see it in some bee lawn mixes. Some of them have moved on to another species called yak yarrow. Yak yarrow is similar in nature to creeping thyme. It's a little bit easier for folks to establish, and it's a little bit easier for seed companies like my own to source. So if you see yak yarrow instead of creeping thyme, I wouldn't worry at all. It is beautiful. It's easy to establish. It's great for pollinators. So you might see either of those two species present in bee lawn mixtures. And finally, Dutch white clover. Dutch white clover is a non-native plant, but it has exceptional pollinator value. So it's got these open, medium-sized blooms that lends itself well to a great diversity of pollinators. The value of the floral rewards is very well studied in Dutch white clover, and both the nectar and the pollen are very high quality. So that means pollen that's rich in protein content and nectar that's rich in sugar content. And another little benefit of Dutch white clover is it is a legume, meaning that it is a nitrogen fixing plant. This means it can take atmospheric nitrogen, bring it back into the soil, and nitrogen is the most important nutrient for overall plant health. So rather than applying a nitrogen-based fertilizer, you throw a little bit of Dutch white clover in there. It fixes that nitrogen, makes it available to the plants in your yard. Another plant that you will not see in bee lawn mixtures, but a plant that we encourage folks to maintain in their yard because it does provide ample benefits, is common violet. Common violet is beautiful. It spreads so nicely through yards because it's rhizotomous. It blooms early in the season when there's less out blooming in nature. It does super well in sun and shade. Something that I find to be very exciting is that it serves as a host plant for many insect species, many beneficial insect species, that is. So serving it as a host plant is a little different from providing forage. When we're thinking about forage provisions, nectar, pollen, pollinators visit, they grab their nectar and pollen, and they get out of there. Host plants are plants that insects lay their eggs on. So there are some species of lepidopterans, moths, butterflies, skippers, etc., that will lay their eggs on the common violet. Those eggs will mature into larvae, and they'll eat the vegetation of the common violet. And there are some very important lepidopteran species that are specialists, meaning they only want to lay their eggs on common violet or species closely related to it. So common violet, if you're lucky enough to have it in your yard, lucky you. If not, don't worry about it. And you could even maybe find some seed packets out there. The only reason that common violet isn't included in bee lawn mixtures is because it is a very, very poor producer of seed, and those seeds are very, very difficult to harvest. But that rhizomatous growth comes into play because if you do have a present in your yard, boy, is it going to spread. This is a beautiful picture of common violet growing in a Minneapolis yard. Something that I've thought is, I don't know who could ever think that a turfgrass carpet is more beautiful than a lawn that looks like this, full of beautiful flowering plants. I think if we think about the gifts that we give to our loved ones, I don't think anyone's ever giving someone a strip of turfgrass in a vase, but we might very well give them a bouquet of flowers. I think, to me personally, I find flowers to be a lot more beautiful than a turfgrass lawn, a solely turfgrass lawn. And I hope other folks can adopt that point of view as well, that flowers are more beautiful than turfgrass, even in a lawn. So now that we have a good understanding of the floral species that work nicely within a bee lawn, let's talk about who actually visits. What kind of bee diversity are we seeing within a bee lawn? So on the self-heal, these bigger world blooms that might be difficult for smaller bees to get their rewards from because they've got those short little bee tongues. What we expected to see was big chunky bees, like this beautiful chunky bumblebee. You could see the beautiful pollen packed into its packed onto its legs there, what we call the pollen basket of the bee. And this is exactly what we expected. What we did not expect to see were small bees on the self-heal. We found that smaller bees were able to forage on the self-heal because they were actually able to crawl into that corolla of the flower, the floral neck, get their rewards, crawl out, and fly away. So we saw kind of two ends of the spectrum, the really large bees and the really small bees, and not too much in between. It was a very interesting phenomenon. Something else that we noticed was that the research said this flower was primarily a nectar source. We found some evidence to suggest that bees were also using this as a source of protein. So before I start this video, I want to talk about how important that actually is. So nectar. Bees, again, not different from little children. Nectar means sugar. Bees will get their sugar from just about anywhere. When you hear folks talk about specialist bees versus non-specialist bees, that does not refer to where they'll get their nectar from. That strictly refers to where they'll get their protein from. So a generalist bee will get their nectar from anywhere still, but they'll only want to get a generalist bee will get both their nectar and their pollen from a wide range of plants, but a specialist bee will still get its nectar from a wide range of plants, but its protein, it will source its protein from a very specific group of plants. So what I want you to watch on this video is how the bee's legs move while it's on this flower. So while it's on this flower, you'll see those legs doing what's called a combing behavior. It's combing pollen down the hairs of its body into those pollen baskets. And this combing behavior is indicative of the fact that the bee is gathering pollen from the flower, putting it into its pollen baskets, and using it as a source of protein to feed itself and its young ones. The bee nerd in me cannot turn away a wonderful chance to do some fun bee identification. If you were to ever see a bee and you see this little W outline in yellow on its abdomen, that is indicative of a bumblebee species called Bombus bimaculatus. So if you're ever on a walk and want to impress some friends, you look for the yellow W and you know you've got some Bombus bimaculatus. But again, the important part of this video was we saw that combing behavior. That combing behavior is indicative of gathering and feeding on pollen, which is super exciting. It means we're not just, drinking apple juice and eating ice cream looking for sugar. We're getting those rich sources of protein that allow us to grow and mature and develop. So if there's one thing that I would want folks to leave here knowing about self-heal, it's that this native flower was absolutely a hotspot for native pollinators. More than 95% of the bee visitors observed on self-heal were native species. So if you want something to support your natives, self-heal does an exceptional job. With creeping thyme, small wide open blooms, we saw exactly what we expected. Lots of small, beautiful sweat bees, beautiful Lasioglossum bees, visiting this flower. I never really saw anything much bigger than a honeybee on this flower. So I think medium and smaller, with the vast majority of the bees observed being these smaller bees. What was interesting about the creeping thyme was when it was blooming. If we think about our gardens, they're a little bit sparse in the spring, but luckily that's when our pollinating trees and shrubs are blooming, flowering trees and shrubs are blooming. If we think about our gardens in the middle of summer, they are blooming profusely. Our gardens are looking amazing. May, June, July, August. But then as we get towards the end of the summer, as we start to hit fall, the blooms are a little bit more sporadic, a little more sparse. So it's really exciting to see a plant like this, like the creeping thyme, blooming into September. And now, as our climate begins to shift and adapt a little bit, change, if you will, we can even sometimes see these blooms into October. So a late blooming flower that's providing food when there's a lot less food available throughout the landscape. Very exciting to the pollinator nerds like myself. So if there's one thing that I want you to remember about the creeping thyme, it's that it is the latest to bloom of all the bee lawn flowers. It provides some food when there's not as much food out there in the landscape. Dutch white clover, an absolute superstar in terms of supporting pollinators and providing a high quality source of forage. So we saw small to large sized visitors. This beautiful sweat bee, some native some native ground nesting bees, a beautiful bumblebee, and even honeybees. So I do want to make a clear distinction here. When we're thinking about how can we support our pollinators, honeybees are a little bit different. Our wild bees, our native bees, are not receiving support from humans. Honeybees are more like managed livestock, not too different from the pig farmer that you know or the cattle farmer that you know. They are receiving habitat in the form of hive boxes, and they're going out there and sharing forage with pollinators, with our wild and native bees. There's a lot of opinions out there about just how harmful honeybees are to our wild bees. But what I want you to think about when it comes to bee lawns is the more food we put out for all pollinators, the better. If we have something that provides ample resources for native bees, wild bees, and honeybees alike, that is a great thing. So when we think about Dutch white clover, that kind of mental note that I would want you to make is this is a critical source of forage for honeybees and native bees alike. So on just Dutch white clover, we saw more than 55 bee species, and our sampling was limited to only public parks in Minneapolis. If you think about the state of Minnesota, that's a tiny sample size for trying to estimate bee diversity across an entire state and across an entire planting type. So this 55 bee species number was incredibly exciting. In similar research studies where they tried to assess the bee diversity on Dutch white clover, some folks were finding 20, 30 species in that range. We saw an incredible level of bee diversity. This number blew us away. When we looked at bee diversity across all floral species included within a bee lawn, we saw more than 65 bee species, which is good for more than 10% of all of the bees in Minnesota. An absolutely wild number, considering the extent of research that was done, the extent of sampling that was done. So this 10% number on just 3 flowering species, incredible. So I know that many of us in this room are going to be huge supporters of pollinator conservation, but you may have loved ones in your life that are part of your decision-making process in terms of what gets planted in the managed landscapes that you are in control of. And even if folks don't love pollinators, I am yet to meet the person who does not love local, delicious food. There was some great research done. I used to say recently, this research is now almost 10 years old, which, boy, makes me feel a little bit old. There was some great research that found that converting just 5% of a lawn to some sort of pollinator-friendly landscape can have benefits to local urban gardens and local urban farms. And while I've met many folks who don't love pollinators as much as I do, most everyone out there loves delicious, local, humanely sourced food. So that should just be another tool in your toolbox of how can I convince folks that this is a planting that's worthwhile? So that kind of jumps through the building blocks of what is a bee lawn. Now we can talk about how can we actually get this planting installed? How do we install and maintain a bee lawn? And a little bit of a spoiler, that maintenance section is going to be super, super short. Bee lawns are super low input. Once they have established and mature, they're pretty much as close as to it. They're pretty much as close as a set it and forget it type planting as you can get within the world of lawns and planted landscapes. So first, let's talk about the timing of installing a bee lawn. There's going to be 3 periods of time that are absolutely great for installing a bee lawn, and then I'm going to beg each and every one of you to avoid 1 period of time. So first, the early spring, which is knocking on our door right now. So after the snow melts and we start to accumulate some warmth, you want to get your bee lawn seed down so that it can start collecting what's called degree days. Degree days are an accumulation of warmth over time that allows plants to germinate and establish. If you were to install a bee lawn in the spring, you could expect same year germination and even some blooms. I always encourage folks to observe their lawns over time. In year 1, you're going to see primarily vegetation with some blooms. But if you look at your bee lawn and you see it's a little bit thin, a little bit sporadic, a little bit patchy, a good time to overseed and supplement that bee lawn is in this transition from summer to fall, somewhere between August 15th and September 15th. As soon as the state of Minnesota starts selling like corn dogs or Sweet Martha's cookies, that means you're probably in the right time of year to overseed your bee lawn. Speaking of that window, the late summer, that transition from summer to fall, somewhere between August 15th and September 15th, is the second fantastic window to install a bee lawn. At this point, we're getting exceptional temperatures. We want soil temperatures around 60 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Our high temperatures in this time of year are generally right within that range. And what we'd expect here is same year germination of the plants, of the grasses and some of the flowers. No blooms in year 1, blooms would come the following year. The one thing you could run into, and it's becoming less common, if that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's debatable. But our winters aren't hitting nearly as early as they used to. This has certainly some drawbacks. You've probably heard much discussion about that. But in this one instance, winters being less likely to hit early helps us because our plants are receiving enough time to get established in our soils where they're not going to be killed off by an early frost. That being said, if the blizzard of 91 were to strike again and we get this awful freezing cold snow earlier in the year than what's expected, that could result in your flowers struggling to establish. So it's just something to keep your mind on. Or if you were to install your bee lawn during this window and we get a really, really early frost, that could create some issues. What you'll notice within these first two windows, early spring, late summer transition from summer to fall, I very intentionally skipped the heat of summer. I would say the most common reason I've heard folks having trouble getting a bee lawn installed is because they tried to install it in the middle of July when it was 95 degrees out. When that's the case, you are going to struggle to get just about any plant growing. The water needs of a plant are going to be much, much higher during the heat of summer. And that is especially the case with germinating grass seed, with plants trying to germinate from seed. Our native plants with deep, extensive root systems, they're going to be far more resilient. Our immature baby plants and seeds have much higher water needs. Satiating those needs in the heat of summer, very difficult. The final seeding window that I want to talk about is a personal favorite of mine, and that is a dormant seeding. This is done in the late fall, just before the frost hits. What we do is we check our weather app, we check the weather station. When we see that first frost coming in, you put the seed down. Then it's not going to establish just yet. It's going to go through freezes and thaws throughout the winter, which is going to work that seed into the ground. And then when we hit our snowmelt this time of year, that snowmelt is going to keep the seed nice and moist. It dramatically lowers the need for applying water to a bee lawn in order to get it established. So one of the benefits of a dormant seeding is a much reduced need for watering because the snowmelt keeps the seed moist. So it's kind of an eco-friendly way to do this. If you don't have a fancy irrigation system and you don't have the time to go out there and water it in, a dormant seeding is a fantastic option. So when we're installing a bee lawn, this can be done in one of two methods. You can overseed it directly into your lawn, or you can do this as part of a new lawn renovation. So of course, an overseeding is going to be much easier. You're going out there with your spreader, you're cutting your lawn nice and low, you're bagging up the clippings, and you're just pushing one of those rotary spreaders out there, throwing the seed out. A new lawn renovation is going to be a little bit more exhaustive. You have to remove the pre-existing vegetation and then drop the seed down. And there's some basic rules as to which one is going to be the better fit. Overseeding is going to be a great fit if you have the right turfgrass species present. Now, I'm sure everyone remembers every single word that I've said throughout this presentation, so you don't need a reminder of which species those are. But if someone just walked into the room 5 seconds ago, I'll go over it just in case. Kentucky bluegrass and fine fescues are the grass species that do best with our flowers, so they're the easiest ones to overseed into. Whereas the tall fescues, perennial ryegrasses, or whatever other turfgrass species you might have in your lawn, those don't mesh quite as well with your flowers. Additionally, we want to be thinking about weed presence within the lawn. Weeds are in many cases highly aggressive. In most cases, an established weed is going to outcompete a floral species trying to grow from seed. The magic number that I normally point folks to is 33%, 1/3. If you think that more than 1/3 of your lawn is covered with weeds, we probably want to do this as a new lawn renovation. If you're below that 1/3 threshold, then you're likely good to go. So this is just a little cheat sheet in terms of what's going to be best suited for you, an overseeding or a new lawn renovation. So let's talk about how you would actually overseed a bee lawn. So remember, an overseeding is best suited for a fine fescue or bluegrass lawn with limited weed infestation. So step 1 is to mow that lawn as short as possible. And step 2 is to rake away the clippings. The goals of steps 1 and 2 combined is to expose as much soil as possible. One of the most basic rules in the world of establishing plants from seed, this goes for turfgrass and flowers alike, is that those seeds are only going to germinate and establish if they're making contact with the soil. So taking these first 2 measures makes it far more likely that your grass and flower seed is going to make contact with the soil bed. Finally, once we've done that, we want to spread that seed out. And then it's no different than establishing any other turf grass lawn. You want to keep it moist until it sprouts, and then you want to cut back on the watering and fertilizer once your bee lawn is fully mature. At the time of seeding, it is beneficial to put down a starter fertilizer to help get those plants going. But once this planting is established and mature, you never have to fertilize again. So we fertilize once and never again in order to get a bee lawn established. Some little tips for maintenance. We want to keep these a little bit higher. There's some fantastic research out of the UMass Amherst that found that a lazy lawnmower is good for getting more blooms within a lawn where we want flowers to be present. If we were going to do just one mow, I would say to trim your bee lawn back in the fall. It's easier for plants to overwinter at a shorter height. And please, 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 I'm begging you, do not use your herbicides within your bee lawn. Herbicides cannot tell the plants you like from those you don't like. Herbicides will absolutely kill your bee lawn flowers. If you see something you really don't like, hand weeding is your best bet. So I do have to recognize that many of us are not going to have this picture perfect scenario where an overseeding is going to be possible. So let's talk about how we would do this as a new lawn renovation. So yes, we do have to start from scratch. There's a little bit of a monetary investment or an investment of some resources, but we often see the best overall results when we do this as a new lawn renovation. The reason for that is we do not have to worry at all about our seed to soil contact ratios. None of our seeds getting caught up in some grass or getting caught up in some clippings that miss the mower. It's all making perfect contact with the soil because we've removed the vegetation. So you've taken that out of the equation. So how do we actually remove vegetation to do a new lawn renovation? There are all sorts of methods. You can be like the woman on the left who's very brave in using a shovel. You could use a skid steer or a dingo like we're seeing in the middle, or you could use some more advanced cultural techniques like a solarization, which is similar to what we're being seen done on the right here. So shovel, if you're doing a very small area, you want to test it out and do a couple hundred square feet, you turn that soil with the shovel, or you even just dig out the turf grass and pull it away. That works great. For me personally, if I'm doing a small section, I like to go to my local small equipment shop, rent one of these sod cutters. You use the power of your foot to push that blade underneath the turf grass. You pull it right out and you plant into the beautiful soil underneath your turf. I think my back has never regretted the small expenditure that is renting the sod cutter. But yes, if you're doing a small area, the shovel, the sod cutter, tools you'll always be thankful for. There are also gas-powered sod cutters. And if you're doing a very large project, a dingo or a skid steer, it runs a small shovel through your turf grass, scoops it right out. You dump it into a little dumpster like you see next to the gentleman using that piece of equipment on the right here. Another great option for doing a bee lawn. For me, if I'm doing a big project, maybe 1,000 square feet or more, I rent something more high powered like the tools you see here. If I'm doing a smaller project under 1,000 square feet or so, I go with something like this. So there are also some cultural methods that you could use when it comes to preparing your landscape. I'll go over two of them. I'll go over them shortly. But what I want everyone to take note of is the words that I have below this image. The Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation has a fantastic overview of some organic methods that can be used to prepare areas for new plantings. These are just two of them. There's a few more techniques that they discussed in that guide. I highly encourage folks to give them a read through and see if any of them are a good fit for the work you're looking to do in your yard. This goes for bee lawns or native plantings alike. It's a fantastic resource that I lean on constantly. So with the solarization, what we do is we lay down clear or black plastic over the top of the area we wish to convert. We tamp it down with rocks or whatever materials are going to keep that plastic in place, and we allow that area to accumulate heat over time. We're essentially making a little vegetation oven that's going to cook our plants, kill them off over the course of a few months. Generally, you want to do this solarization for 3 months or more. If you're in a shady area, you're on the or more side of the equation. If you're in a very sunny area, 3 months will do the trick for you. Once you pull back that plastic, you can just easily pull out or rake away the dead plants, and voila, you've got a beautiful area to plant right into. There's some discussion about how beneficial or non-beneficial this is for soil health. If that's something you're worried about, it might not be a bad idea to integrate some compost into this area before seeding. A little bit of compost is certainly never going to hurt. So at worst, you're at a net neutral. At best, this is going to be a beneficial thing to do for your landscape. Another good option is what we call sheet mulching, or something that I affectionately call lawn lasagna. What we're doing here is we cut down the grass as short as possible, and then we're putting down layers of soil and cardboard and soaking in between. So you'll mow it down, compost, cardboard, soak, compost, cardboard, soak. In year one, what many folks will do is they'll put down just a little cover crop plant, some oats or something of that nature, to bide their time while all that cardboard is breaking down. And then in year two and beyond, that's when they'll put down their B-lawn mixture. So another great option, but something that's true of both of these techniques is, yes, they're so eco-friendly. Yes, they are not as exhaustive as digging up an area with a shovel or a sod cutter, but they absolutely take a little bit more time. Where no matter what technique you choose to prepare your landscape, there's going to be some sort of resource that you're expending: effort, time, or money. Sometimes a combination of all of them. So, believe it or not, there is some science behind how you want to seed your lawn. You'll want to use what's called a perpendicular seeding, meaning you take your full seeding rate for a B-lawn mix that's about 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet, and you want to spread your rate at a half rate going in each direction. So you'll spread half that seed, 2.5 pounds, going in the north-south direction, and then you'll run it again and go 2.5 pounds in the east-west direction. After you put the seed down, it's always recommended to lightly rake that seed into the soil. I myself found this out the hard way. The very first time I tried to do a B-lawn at a home I was renting, I just threw the seed out there and I was like, we'll see what happens. Genuinely, within 10 minutes, my roommate called me over and pointed to the birds eating my seed. So please take the extra 15 minutes to rake that seed in. Otherwise, you're just creating an expensive bird feeder. An alternative to raking the seed into the soil is if you want to top dress with a teeny tiny covering of high quality soil, that'll also do the trick. A quarter inch, even less, an eighth of an inch or so will do the trick for hiding that seed. Once you do that, you want to do one heavy watering directly after putting the seed down, and then you want to implement a light and frequent watering program. I do notice a little typo here. That says 3 times per week. You want to do 3 light waterings per day to get this established. So setting up your irrigation system or going out with a sprinkler 3 times a day, 5 to 7 minutes for the first 3 weeks is going to get you your best results. Once your plants have germinated, you can reduce that dramatically. So a little pictorial example of what this will look like. So step 1, we're removing that turf by hand, machine, or cultural method. If we want to use this as an opportunity to improve our soil quality, adding a compost or some sort of soil amendment as needed could be beneficial here. Breaking up that soil with a rake can also be nice and helpful. If we think about seed and how it likes to establish, it does not want to establish into heavy, compacted soil. It would much prefer to establish into light, fluffy soil. So a nicely raked soil with a nice little layer of compost is going to be in our plant's best interest. And from there, the steps are the same. We spread the seed, we lightly rake it in. If we want to, using a germination blanket could be beneficial here. Really what you want to do is use any sort of tool to cover that seed. We don't want to be like me where the seed is just becoming a bird feeder. You either want to cover it with a germination blanket, lightly rake it into the soil, or cover it with a little bit of a dusting of soil. Then we keep it moist till germination. And again, the same maintenance as before. We reduce our mowing. We do that one trim in the fall at a minimum, and we make sure to never use herbicides within a B-lawn planted area. So a little cut sheet for you to refer back to when you're referring to this presentation in the future. Just a short little comparison of an overseeding versus a new lawn renovation. Something that you'll see under that overseeding section is for seed mix. There are some options for wildflower only B-lawn mixtures. If you either, you like your lawn and just want to add flowers to it, or you already have some fine fescue in there, going for a flowers only option is great. If you have a non-fescue lawn, I do often recommend doing the general B-lawn seed mix with both wildflowers and the fine fescue grass. Having grass is an important component of a B-lawn. Flowers come and go throughout the season. Fine fescue is there year-round. It's a great tool for reducing stormwater runoff, for reducing erosion off of our planted landscapes. So in terms of the ongoing maintenance, this is going to be a rather short section of this presentation. Um, Most of the work for a bee lawn is in that establishment and germination section. What I'm going to ask folks to do is we're going to do a lot of work to make sure that this germinates and establishes successfully. And once that lawn is present, you're pretty much good to go, but we'll still go over the techniques that are needed for maintenance. So for plant establishment, we want to water frequently during the establishment phase. We're trying to get out there daily, ideally 2 to 3 times per day for those first 2 to 3 weeks. We're making sure these plants get that water that they need in order to establish. That way we can reap the benefits of having a low input planted landscape. We want to continue watering intermittently for the first year, maybe once a week, maybe 1 to 2 times per week during the heat of summer. And if we can, fitting in a couple little weedings is going to be beneficial as well. And remember, we're not using herbicide. We're hand weeding or using some sort of tool like a dandelion popper to help us here because an herbicide is going to kill our plants. And what we remember here is, yes, we're putting in some effort in year 1, but boy, once those flowers get established, once those new grasses get established, we are going to have a very naturally resilient, naturally eco-friendly landscape. Mowing, my absolute favorite part of a bee lawn outside of the actual conservation component, conservation of pollinators, that is. Bee lawns get mowed far less frequently than your traditional turf grass lawns. A bee lawn is going to typically get mowed 2 to 4 times per year. If they're in a sunny area, they'll grow a little bit faster, which will require a little bit more frequent mowing. If they're in a shadier spot, they're not going to grow quite as quickly, and they'll have fewer mows. What I typically do with a bee lawn is I let it grow up to about 6 inches, think just above your ankle, and then I cut them back to about 4 inches in height. I like a slightly taller height for a bee lawn because research has shown that a slightly taller lawn results in more flowers. Fertilizer. I have never, ever, not a single time outside of the germination phase, fertilized a bee lawn. We use a starter fertilizer to get it started, and we never have to use a nitrogen-based fertilizer that's designed for upkeep. That clover is doing the heavy lifting. Clover and your clippings are supplying all the nitrogen that this lawn will ever need. Irrigation, we are dramatically reducing irrigation within your lawn area. Where Kentucky bluegrass gets watered a couple times per week, we're watering a couple times per month. Generally, what I do is I water once every 3 weeks in the spring and fall. And in the heat of summer, we're bumping that up to maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks. And my cat has decided to join the presentation. I'm going to try and keep her at bay here. Sorry, one moment here as I deal with some kitty cat-based issues. Okay, and we're back. Sammy is not shy enough sometimes. Okay, irrigation. In the heat of summer, we're watering once every week, maybe once every 2 weeks. In the spring and fall, we're watering once every 2 to 3 weeks. The one thing that could be beneficial to add to your lawn management program is an annual dethatching, especially if you're really letting your lawn grow thick and dense and a little bit more wild. When we do that, some thatch, that layer of broken down vegetation between your soil and your living vegetation can start to build up. So what we could do is we could lightly run a dethatcher through our lawn once per year to remove any of that decomposing plant material. This isn't the end-all, be-all of your bee lawn, but if you don't do this, then you might have a little bit of die-off here and there, in which all you'll have to do is put down a little bit more of your bee lawn mix. So you either dethatch or lightly overseed intermittently to deal with those thatch issues. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. I see that we've got some piling in. If I know Megan, Alexandra, I bet she's answered some already. But Alexandra, should we start with some Q&A?
Yeah, let's go ahead and jump into it. And I didn't answer any of them at all because I felt like you could do a much better job than I could.
No
Um,
worries.
so starting with the yak yarrow, Elisa asked, does yak yarrow need sandy soil too?
So one of the things that encouraged me myself to switch over to yak yarrow from creeping thyme, but one of the greatest benefits of the yak yarrow is it is much more adaptable to different soil types. It'll do well in diverse soil types. Um, in fact, something really cool about yak yarrow, this is one that the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program studied, and it was one of the top performers in their low input trials, meaning what vegetation can do well when we neglect it. So yak yarrow, a much more adaptable species than the creeping thyme.
I think in a similar strain, Maggie was asking, would it be adaptable enough to work in compact clay soil?
Yeah, similar question. So what I'll say first is there there are no plants that prefer compacted clay soils, but yak yarrow is going to have a higher likelihood of success as compared to the creeping thyme. Truth be told, I get calls about compacted soils all the time for work. There are some things you could do in the world of plant selection to help alleviate those issues, but without a doubt, management is the key to working with compacted soils. Aeration is going to be a big help. Working in some lighter soil or compost is going to be a big help. Using a product like C20, which does microbial aeration, can be a big help. So plant selection, a small part of the solution, management, a big part of the solution when working in compacted soils.
Awesome. I am gonna jump around a little bit here because I think a lot of people kind of crowdsource some answers on where to get creeping thyme. Um, and Elise also asked, can the solarization methods help take out creeping Charlie?
It can. I've seen it successful in taking out creeping Charlie. I've also seen it unsuccessful in creeping Charlie. Patience is going to be your best friend here. There's no two ways around it. Creeping Charlie is an absolute bear of a weedy species. You can have success with sheet mulching and creeping Charlie. You can have success with solarization creeping Charlie. It is really, really difficult to remove. Um, Many people, myself included, are very hesitant when it comes to using herbicides. I think it's important to remember that herbicides are a tool in the toolbox, but I like to encourage folks to think of them as an absolute last resort. This cat is absolutely relentless. They are a last result, and creeping Charlie is one of those last resort instances in my head. Now, what's important to remember about herbicides is they are not all equivalent in their toxicity. Um, there's a really great option that where the active ingredient is going to be chelated iron. Chelated iron is very effective at removing weedy species, and it's not nearly as toxic as other herbicides. So if you're thinking, Roundup, super toxic. If you're thinking organophosphates, super toxic. Chelated iron is a much more humane option for all herbicide activity, including the removal of creeping Charlie. Granted, it's still going to be a little bit of work. It generally requires multiple applications of that chelated iron, but it's a much more humane option in the world of herbicides.
Thank you. I think that also got to Elliot's question, which was just like best methods for removing creeping Charlie from the lawn. I will
Oh,
say really quickly too,
yeah.
though, that the follow-up question is about Sammy. Everyone wants to see her, and every time we get close to that comment, she comes on
Oh my
camera. So
goodness. Yeah, this is Sammy. She's in the cone of shame, not for her own doing. She's a very good kitty cat, but she just needed a little surgery recently, so dad's keeping some extra eyes on her to make sure she doesn't, open the wound or anything. Um, she is the cuddliest cat in the world. Oh my goodness. And she has hijacked the presentation yet again.
okay, thank you for that. I think everybody had
Okay.
been wanting to see her face, but we can go
Yeah, my
back.
pleasure. And what she did there is she dove on the keyboard there, which she has been known to do, and momentarily lost control of the laptop. But we're back. We're back. She's a very good girl.
So thinking too just about any other sort of like weed management. So a couple others that are showing up in here are dandelions. Another one I know comes up pretty frequently is like creeping bellflower,
Creeping
which is a
bellflower.
nasty one. But it just, yeah, in terms of preparation and weeds, what are some things that you should be looking out for and best prep methods, I guess,
Yeah.
top ones.
So something that I love to do is steal ideas from people way smarter than me. Dr. Eric Watkins at the university's turfgrass science lab, which is really just a conservation science lab that happens to study turfgrass. What he's always said is that the best weed prevention is a thick and healthy vegetative stand. If you make sure that whatever vegetation you're using is dense and thick and well taken care of, that's going to be your best bet at managing weeds. A really great example of this is when I was at Metro Blooms, the planting density we would use for our native plantings was in the neighborhood of she's back was in the neighborhood of was 3 plants for every 2 square feet. So going really dense with your plantings so that there's less room for weeds. The same would go for a bee lawn. Get that bee lawn established nice and thick. There's less room for weeds to come in. Um, she's insane. Outside of that, hand weeding is going to be your best bet. There's similar tools out of it. A tool that I use is called Grandpa's Weeder if you want to save your back a little bit. Um, the paintbrush method, if any of you are familiar with that. So this is an herbicide-based method, but it is a far more precise herbicide-based method. Rather than just spraying it willy-nilly throughout the planted area, you dip a paintbrush into the herbicide, you apply it directly to the vegetation of what you want to remove. Of course, over a 10,000 square foot lawn, that's going to be tough, but it's just some food for thought. Um, Different weeds are more aggressive or less aggressive than others. When I see dandelion, I don't worry too much. When I see chickweed, I don't worry too much. When I see creeping Charlie, I worry a lot. So how you want to interact with a weed is going to differ from species to species.
That's great. Thank you. Robert, I know put this in right when we were talking about dethatching, but how about core aerating and when is a good time to use that?
Coloration is fantastic. We actually looked at core aeration and bee lawn establishment at the university. Um, the more compacted your soil, the more beneficial it is to core aerate. If you've got this rich black dirt, I wouldn't worry about it. If you've got sandy soil, I wouldn't worry about it. If you're in a part of Minnesota with compacted soil, compacted clay soil, aeration is going to be your best friend. So highly recommended for hard clay soils. I get flashbacks to my time at Metro Blooms trying to establish a rain garden in those super dense clay soils. Aeration highly recommended for those areas. It's never going to be a bad thing to do. It's either going to be a net neutral at worst or extremely beneficial if you're working in compacted soils.
Rachel jumped in just to say that lucky her, she's a novice and isn't really sure about why creeping Charlie is a worry. So wondering if you can kind of talk about how aggressive it is there.
Yeah, this is one of the most common questions that I get. So, okay, how aggressive it is? Extremely aggressive. It is notorious for competitively excluding native plants, turf grass, anything that it comes in contact with. It is notorious for competitively excluding those plants. A little bit about creeping Charlie, if we have the time to be nerds together, which I hope we do. Um, it uses a reward distribution method called the jackpot method, where if we think about a jackpot, most of the time we're losers. Every now and then we're a big winner. So when you think about Creeping Charlie, I want you to get super Minnesotan and think about pull tabs. That is how Creeping Charlie acts as a flower. So the vast majority of those Creeping Charlie flowers, the vast majority of those pull tabs, loser, loser, loser. But I think we've all had that moment where you get that pull tab winner and you're like, my goodness, this is the best way I could spend my resources. All that money we worked hard for, let's go blow it all on pull tabs because that was a fun little adrenaline kick there that we got from the pull tab. But I think when we're all thinking clearly, we know consistent resources, consistent sources of income, much better for us. And the same goes for flowers. Those jackpot creeping Charlie flowers are full of nectar. Those bees are like, wow, this is a great flower. Let's go forage from the creeping Charlie. But some research has shown that creeping Charlie is a very slight um, nutrient gain for a pollinator visiting the plant, whereas other flowers with consistent reward production are a very significant net energy gain for pollinators. The other part of Creeping Charlie is it does not make its pollen available to pollinators, so it is a nectar only resource. So, Creeping Charlie, it is a very slight net gain, but boy, we can do a lot better.
Paula comes in next with what she is classifying as a weird question. My pollinator lawn won't be huge, but when I take my two horses out of the pasture to my large lawn, is it terrible if they graze on my pollinator lawn after it's established? We also have many deer grazing, but not much I can do about that.
It's a good question. That's a new one to me. Um, so deer that part I know about. Deer love short regenerative plants, just like Dutch white clover. I would go as far as to say that if you plant Dutch clover in an area where you know there are deer, they're absolutely gonna chomp that down. I mean, you're gonna feel like you have goats back there because it's the exact type of vegetation that they feed on. I mean, part of what I do is I make like deer pasture mixes, and there's always clovers and brassicas in there. So you're absolutely going to see deer eating. Something's going to eat your clover, whether it's a bee or a deer, coin flip. Um, when it comes to horses, I'm not going to pretend to know my equine science. I'll leave that to the equinologists out there.
That is fair.
It's
Thanks for taking
probably
a crack at
fine,
it.
but
Yeah.
I would look at some horse pasture mixes that are out there and see if there's overlap, but I wouldn't know if it is or is not the most beneficial thing. And Kristen's absolutely right. Bunnies love clover too. A fight I've had many a time. Luckily for me, my dogs do a pretty decent job of keeping the bunnies at bay, but bunnies love clover.
Um, Robert, I'm not sure I have enough clarification on this, but going back to that core aeration, I think just to follow up on doing the core aeration on an established lawn too, or as you're establishing, maybe where does that come in, James?
It's, same deal for both. Some folks like it for establishment, no matter what, whether even if they have a sandy soil or a black dirt, because opening up those little pockets can sometimes be beneficial where the seed sneaks in there. But beneficial no matter what, establishment, regular upkeep. But the thing I think about most is what kind of soil type do you have? The more compacted your soil, the more beneficial aeration is going to be.
Another animal related question here with the yak yarrow. Is there any concern that it's harmful for dogs or cats that are in a yard?
This is another one where we would probably want a food science major. There are, I actually did read about this one. I did read that it is lightly toxic to dogs. That means, don't fill your food bowl with it. It doesn't mean rush to Blue Pearl if the dog eats a tiny bit of the vegetation. I would double check that just to be sure. This is something that I looked up like 6 months ago, but I'm pretty sure that it was in that lightly toxic category, which means you don't replace your kibble with it.
Stellar, thank you. Emma asked, are there more resources you recommend for determining if I should overseed versus do a lawn renovation?
I think the University of Minnesota has a resource on that, but I do think it kind of mirrors what we went over, where it's all about what kind of vegetation is present in your yard now and how weedy is it. The main thing I'm going to be looking at is your species of turf. We want to see that fine fescue or Kentucky bluegrass and just how prevalent weeds are in. Those are the two main things you should be looking at. Shout out Jackie for putting in a toxicity resource for folks. I should probably steal that one for myself too.
Much appreciated, Jackie. And honestly, everybody who's been jumping in the chat and sharing resources together.
This has
Really
been like
appreciate
the
it.
most awesome interactive chat. I mean, Jackie's just out there collecting thumbs up emojis right now. Good for Jackie.
Yes. And we have a lot of other people with cats. They understand the Venice cat, which is great.
Appreciate it. I'll tell Sammy. She's still right next to me. She never leaves my side.
Oh, love it. Well, I will just go ahead and say there she is. That tonight I'll vamp here for just a moment really quickly in case people have any last minute questions. But really appreciate you all for coming this evening. Again, if there are any questions that come up later in your mind, James, I'm wondering if you're willing at all to share your email, but you can also always email the helpline at L2L help@bluethumb.org. We're here for you anytime. Yep, James's email just went into the chat, so grab that if you need it. And then if you requested a coach, we are working on that this week and you'll hear from us soon. But otherwise, this is kind of the end of our webinar series. So you're off on your own to start doing your planning and project completion. Really looking forward to see what y'all come up with.
Feel free to flood my inbox. This is what I live for.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Thank you.